Okay, so we're on the very last part of chapter 1, part 4. Okay, so we're going to start off talking about the levels of biological organization. And so we're going to talk about each one of these individually. We're going to go from atoms to molecules, to macromolecules to organelles, organelles to cells, then tissues, organs, organ systems, organism to populations, community, ecosystem, biosphere. In the figure here on our left, you can see the different levels. And so we start off with atoms here. We have an atom of hydrogen and oxygen, molecule, macromolecule, and so on and so forth. So again, we're going to look at each one of these individually. Okay, so before we jump into looking at them individually, I just need to define a few terms for you. Make sure that you have an understanding of how scientists can work at different levels in this biological hierarchy. And sometimes when scientists take apart the pieces, we miss things, okay? So the first definition on here is reductionism. So again, scientists sometimes will take apart complex systems, right? So instead of studying the entire biosphere or studying an entire ecosystem, they may just study one organism. Or instead of studying an entire organism, they might just study one organ or maybe one cell type. And so reductionism is studying the parts and pieces of a complex system in isolation. And that's fine, right? And so we can study, in this example here at the cellular level, right? This is an image of a human cell. We're going to go over all these parts and pieces when we get to chapter 4. Or we can study at the level of an organ. There's a heart. Or we can study, at the level of an organism, this human. There's a bit of a problem, though, when we take apart the parts and pieces of a complex system. We don't know if when we put those parts and pieces back together, if we're going to get what are called emergent properties. So these are properties that are not there when we study the parts and pieces in isolation. But when we put those parts and pieces back together, when we look at the whole, these new things kind of show up. Okay, so here's an example. If I studied, let's say that this cell right here is a white blood cell. It's a macrophage, one of my favorite white blood cells. If I just studied that cell in cell culture, so in a broth culture in a petri dish or in a test tube, I would learn a lot about that cell. But what I would miss is how that cell interacts with other immune cells of the immune system in the whole organism. So we can take what we learn in the dish, we call that in vitro, and we have to see if that is the same in vivo, in the living organism, as we put those parts and pieces back together. So there's one example. Another example is water, right? So if we were to just look at water, water is made up of oxygen and hydrogen. Okay, H2O, 2 molecules of hydrogen, 1 molecule of oxygen. If we were to take apart that molecule of water and look at the individual atoms, hydrogen is a gas. Oxygen is a gas. But when we put those together in the right ratio, you end up with water, which can be a liquid, a solid, or a gas, depending on temperature. So that's an emergent property. When you put those parts and pieces together, you get something new, something else. So we just have to keep that in the back of our minds. And again, scientists are going to study at the various levels in biological organization. So scientists have to think about that. Okay, so let's start at the simplest level. So we're going to start off with atoms. Okay, and so in the next chapter, in chapter 2, we'll talk more about atoms, but for now, this definition is good enough. An atom is going to be the smallest unit of a chemical element that retains all the properties of that element. So some examples of atoms are carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, helium. Those are all examples of individual atoms. When we put atoms together, right, in very specific ratios, we will get more complex, what we call molecules. Okay, so again, a molecule is made up of 2 or more atoms. So an example of a molecule would be water. Again, water is H2O. Glucose is another example that we're going to see a lot throughout this semester. So glucose, its chemical formula is C6H12O6. You saw that earlier in the chapter. Glucose is another example of a molecule made up of 3 different atoms. And then the next level are macromolecules. So macromolecules, as the name implies, macro meaning large. Macromolecules are large, complex molecules. Okay? And so, for example, here on our right on this slide, the first molecule we have is chlorophyll. And so you can see all the individual atoms of chlorophyll makes up this complex macromolecule. Here's another example. This is a double-stranded DNA molecule. Again, made up of atoms that come together to form molecules, and this is the macromolecule. Okay, we'll come back to looking at DNA structure as well. Okay, so we go atoms to molecules, and molecules to macromolecules. And so our next stop are organelles. And so organelles are going to be composed of macromolecules. Macromolecules that are going to be together functioning in unity to form a compartment inside of a cell called an organelle. These are the functional components of cells. Cells of eukaryotes, like us, are going to compartmentalize different functions. And so organelles allow this compartmentalization. And so on our right here, the top figure, this is an image, this is a nice electron micrograph of a mitochondria. And so again, we're going to learn about that. Let me go back. Sorry. We're going to learn about that in the upcoming chapters, but just to tell you now, the mitochondria is going to be the site of the bulk of aerobic cellular respiration. Okay, so it's a really important organelle that's going to transform energy into a usable form, into that ATP. The second organelle that we see here is a chloroplast, another electron micrograph. Nice image. The chloroplast is going to be found in green photosynthetic organisms like plants, and the chloroplast will be the site of photosynthesis. Some other examples of organelles: the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi body, the lysosome, peroxisome, vacuoles, vesicles, all kinds of different organelles. And again, we're going to learn about those in the next coming chapters. Just keep in the back of your mind that if we're talking about a prokaryotic organism, prokaryotes lack organelles, where eukaryotic organisms have organelles. And we'll talk about that again towards the end of this chapter. Okay. So we go from atoms to molecules to macromolecules to organelles, and the next level of complexity is cells. Okay, so cells are going to be composed of one or more organelles. They are going to be life's fundamental unit of structure and function. We say that cells are going to be the smallest unit that can still be considered alive. So organelles individually are not alive, but cells are alive, right? Okay. There are single-celled organisms, right? So bacteria and the archaea, and there are some protists, some fungi, some plants that are going to be single-celled. And then there are organisms that are multicellular. So many eukaryotes, including animals, are going to be multicellular. Most plants, most fungi. Okay. So for example, in this picture here, this is one cell from a plant leaf, okay? And you can see all of these little oval, green-shaped, green-colored, oval-shaped structures. Those are all chloroplasts. So this particular cell is chock full of chloroplasts. It's going to be found in a leaf, which is the main organ of photosynthesis. And so that's what these cells will be doing. That's why they have so many chloroplasts in them. Okay. The next level of complexity is the tissue. So tissues are going to be composed of multiple cells that are going to be working together to perform a particular function. Okay, so it's a collection of cells, many cells, that are going to work together to perform a function. So in this example here on the right, there's actually 2 different tissues. Both of these are from the leaf. This part of the tissue on the left is part of what's called the parenchyma, or in this case, there's a lot of air spaces, so it's called the spongy parenchyma. And so the cells here in the parenchyma are going to be responsible for photosynthesis. So these are the cells that are going to capture energy from the sun and transform that energy through photosynthesis into food, chemical, stored energy. On the right in this figure is the epidermis, the surface, probably the undersurface of this leaf. And the epidermis is pretty neat. It's composed of a single layer of cells, and you can see these little openings here. Those are called stomata, or stomates. If you take GB2 with us, we'll talk a lot more about plant structure and function. These stomates allow for gas exchange, so CO2's got to come in for photosynthesis, and oxygen gets released out of those stomates. Okay, so we went from cells to tissues, and now we're going to go to organs and organ systems. And so in this figure right here, this is a leaf. This is an example of a plant organ. This is going to be a body part, if it's an organ, or a system, if it's an organ system, that's going to be responsible for a particular function in the organism's body. Organs are made up of tissues. Organ systems are made up of multiple organs. Okay, so again, the example here, this is a maple leaf made up of multiple types of tissues. Its main job is photosynthesis. If I was to look at the whole plant, I would see leaves, stems, roots, maybe even flowers or cones, depending on what kind of plant I'm looking at. Those are organs. Okay, so a leaf is an organ, a stem is an organ, a root is an organ, a flower is an organ. Okay, collectively we have organ systems. Okay, when we put all those organ systems together, okay, so in this example here, right, we have leaves, stems, and roots. We have the shoot system and the root system, we would say. When I put all of those together, I end up with an organism. So an organism is one single individual of a species that is made up of organs and organ systems. The example here is the maple leaf. Okay. If I'm looking at the collection of maple leaves, right, in my forest here, that's going to constitute a population. So a population is going to be all of the individuals of a single species living in the same area at the same time. Okay, that's going to make up our population. Community is the next level of complexity, and so a community is going to include all of the populations of all species that live together and interact in a particular area. So it's going to be, in this example, all of the living things in this forest. So what do we see here? We see maple trees, but we also see other types of plants. And then we also see animals, right? So we have deer in this picture. It would also include all of the microorganisms and fungi and bacteria that are living in the soil. All those living organisms would be included in the community. Scientists that study at this level study how different species interact, different populations of species interact in a given area. Okay, next level of complexity is an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is going to include all of the living organisms, so all of those communities that we talked about, as well as all the non-living stuff that's there. So it would include, the soil and rocks and anything else that's not living in the area. Scientists studying at this level will study how organisms interact with their environment, their non-living environment. So here's an example of this picture. This is a North American forest, and for those of you who hike in the Adirondacks, you're probably really familiar with this type of a picture. I don't know exactly where it's from, but it's definitely a North American forest. Beautiful. Other examples are grasslands, deserts, coral reefs. The Arctic tundra is an example. Okay, rainforests. Those are all ecosystems. So again, scientists study ecosystems. When we put all of the ecosystems on the planet Earth together, we call that the biosphere. It's going to include all of the living organisms on our planet, as well as the atmosphere, the air around, the hydrosphere, which is all the water, and the lithosphere, which is the rock, the dirt, the soil. Okay, so all of those things would be included in the biosphere. Okay, before we get to biodiversity, I just want to remind you that scientists will, again, study at different levels in that biological hierarchy. And they have to remember that even if you're studying, one cell of an organism, you have to think about how does that cell actually operate in the entire organism, or in the organ, or in the organ system. And so that's, again, reductionism and emergent properties. Okay, so for this second part of the chapter, or part 4, the ending of the chapter, we're just going to talk, we've got a couple of slides about the diversity of life. Okay, so currently on our planet, there have been about 1.7 million species identified and classified and named. And scientists believe that that number is just going to grow. We've got a lot more work to do. And they're not exactly sure where that number is going to fall once all is said and done. New species are found all the time. The prediction is somewhere between 8.7 million to 30 million different species of organisms are probably on our planet right now. Okay. The science responsible for classifying and naming organisms is called taxonomy. Okay, so you want to make sure you know what a taxonomist does. They're going to be responsible for naming and classifying any new organisms. Okay. And I wanted to briefly introduce you to phylogeny, to phylogenetic trees. And so shown here on the right is the phylogenetic tree of life. So this is kind of taking into account all organisms on the planet right now. This is a phylogenetic tree. So it's literally a branching structure that shows evolutionary relationship of organisms. And so here at the base or the root of the tree, LUCA, I wrote down here. That stands for Last Universal Common Ancestor. So the last universal common ancestor of all life on our planet would be here at the base of this tree. And again, we're not entirely sure what that organism was. We know that it was a single-celled organism, probably anaerobic. Evolution began from there. And so when we look at this tree, I've lost my cursor, there it is, we can see 3 different what we call domains. And we're going to get into the domain system in just a second. But there are 3 major groups, or we can call them taxa, or we can say domains, on our planet. And so all living organisms on the planet fall into one of these 3 categories. Organisms are either bacteria, and you've heard of bacteria. Some bacteria are gram-positive, some are gram-negative, some are spirochetes, some are bacillus, some are filamentous. Okay, so there's all different types of bacteria, but all the bacteria are closely related to each other, more related to each other than they are to us. Or this group right here, which are called the archaea. Okay, I'll talk about the archaea in just a second. That's the second domain. And the third domain are the eukarya. So again, we are connected. All life on the planet evolved once, and this is the last common ancestor. So let me just briefly go over the differences between the group bacteria, the group archaea, and the group eukarya. So bacteria includes all prokaryotic organisms that are commonly known as bacteria. So again, that term prokaryotic means no nucleus, no other membrane-bound organelles. Okay, bacteria are unicellular. They're composed of just one cell. They do have DNA. Just because they don't have a nucleus does not mean that they don't have DNA. Their DNA is circular, which is different from ours. Ours is linear. The domain archaea, these organisms are also going to be prokaryotic, so they're going to lack a nucleus. They're also going to be unicellular, just like the bacteria. What's different is that these organisms are going to be found in extreme environments. Places where you wouldn't expect life to be found, we're finding them. They also have unique molecular and biochemical characteristics that make them different from bacteria. It's also been shown that they're more closely related to us than bacteria, and so you can kind of see that on this tree, right? So we have our last common ancestor, we have this branch point, and us, eukarya, and the archaea are together on this branch. Okay, so we're more closely related to the archaea than the archaea are to the bacteria, which is a relatively recent discovery. Pretty neat. The last domain there, eukarya, that's where animals, humans, fall into. This includes all eukaryotic organisms, so organisms with a membrane-bound nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. All plants, all fungi, all protists, and all animals are going to fall into that domain. So there's 3 domains on the planet. That brings us here. And so this is important. You want to make sure that you know this breakdown. Okay, so this is the domain to species. We're going to go through this list. So again, all living things are going to fit into one of the 3 domains. Okay, this is how we classify organisms. So again, the 3 domains on the planet are the eukarya, the archaea, and the bacteria. Okay, as we work our way down this list, and you guys have probably seen this, right? So we've got the domain level, the next level down, or the next taxon down, is kingdom, then phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Ooh, this got moved. The species level is the most restricted or least inclusive level, where the domain level is the broadest or most inclusive level. And that's shown really nicely in this figure that I'm going to get to in just a second. A mnemonic to help you remember this: did King Philip come over for good spaghetti? That's how I learned it. I want to make sure that you also understand that every living organism on the planet gets a 2-part name. And so taxonomists use binomial nomenclature, it's called. 2-part name, binomial nomenclature. So everyone gets a genus and a species name. That's your scientific name. So for us, for example, we are Homo sapiens. We belong to the genus Homo and the species Sapien. Okay, so let's look at this diagram here. So again, we're at the top, right? This top taxon, which is called domain, and the domain we're looking at in this figure is the domain eukarya. And look how broad, look how many different types of organisms are in here. So we've got some plants, right? There's a plant here and a plant here. We've got some protists. So this looks like a euglena. And here's another protist here. This is probably an amoeba. We've got some fungi. So look at the mushroom here and here. So we've got plants, we've got protists, we've got fungi, and we've got animals. So everybody from here over is an animal. Okay? So very, very broad, very inclusive. As we work our way down to the next level here, kingdom, look how it just got smaller. It got more restricted. It got less inclusive. So who's not here? Oh, there's my pointer. Okay. So this is the kingdom Animalia. You can see that Animalia. And so who's not here? Anybody who's not an animal. So you can see that all the plants, the fungi, and the protists are now not in that picture. If we go one level down to phylum, so the phylum here is Chordata. These are going to include only animals that are chordates, right? That have either a notochord or a vertebral cord. Okay, only the chordatas. And so what left out of here? The echinoderms, right? So starfish here. The insects here, the arachnids, so this spider, and this looks like maybe a tick of some sort. They're not going to be included. They are not chordates. This jellyfish, this roundworm, this crustacean, none of them are going to be in the phylum Chordata, so they're all out of this picture. We go down to the next level. The class, Mammalia, even more restricted. Only mammals are in there. Down to order, just primates. Okay, down to family. We've gotten rid of some. And then here, genus and species. Look, species level. Individuals who belong to the same species are going to be able to reproduce and produce fertile, viable offspring. So that's the definition of a species. And so you can see that that's the most restrictive. The only organism here is the chimp, right? Everybody else is gone. Okay, one last slide. I just wanted to give you one last slide here talking about other branches of biology. So we've already just talked about taxonomists. They're going to be responsible for naming and classifying organisms. But there are other various other fields and branches in biology that you should be a little bit familiar with. And so pictured here is a molecular biologist. And actually towards the end of this semester, you guys are going to get a chance to kind of act like a molecular biologist in the lab. Molecular biology is going to be the study of biological processes and their regulation at the molecular level. So at the level of DNA, at the level of protein, so molecular. Biochemistry, that's going to be the study of chemistry of the biology of organisms. So looking at biological processes, chemical processes inside of an organism. That's biochemistry. Microbiology is going to be the study of the structure and function of microorganisms like bacteria and viruses. Neurobiology, study of the nervous system. Paleontology is the study of life's history by looking at fossils. Zoology is the scientific study of animals. And botany is going to be the study of plants. So again, just an introduction to some different areas in biology. And that concludes chapter 1.